Right, so I'll do a brief introduction, then we give you the floor. So we want to welcome everyone to the final session, which is a keynote from Professor Thomas Thiel. He's a professor in psychology, in the historical, theoretical, and critical studies in psychology. And he works at York University in Toronto, Canada. He has been active in the advancement of theoretical and critical and historical psychology throughout his professional career. And just to summarize, not to read everything, he has published more than 300 academic publications. And he is the former leader of the, I wanted to highlight that, the International Society for Theoretical Psychology. And many people interested in critical psychology know his name. There is a lot of work that he has done. He is no stranger who needs an extensive introduction. So we're honored today to have Professor Thiel here with us. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Professor Thiel and put myself on mute for now. Over to you, Professor.
Okay,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your introduction and for the invitation. Is the screen visible? Is the screen sharing okay? If not, let me know. Also, if there's some audio issues, please let me know. And hopefully we can rectify that. This talk is basically about knowledge. And what I basically propose is three moves or three acts, if you like. One move that I call auto-epistemology, a second move that I call EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, and the third move is critical EDI, which is critical equity, diversion, and inclusion studies. And its relevance, of course, to knowledge. So that's what I want to talk about in this presentation. Oops. Okay, so I'm going to start with a hypothetical example from a previously published article. I'm going to talk about what I mean by auto-epistemology. I want to connect EDI and critical EDI to knowledge, emphasize the importance of connecting the question of knowledge with power, privilege, and supremacy, and then make some concluding suggestions. So let me start with a hypothetical example, and I'm using a hypothetical example because I don't want to reproduce racist or classist or sexist ideas. And I think that hypothetical example captures actually the process of psychology, traditional psychology, pretty well. So once upon a time, a writer proposed that humanity should be divided into large-eared and small-eared people. Because they lack interpersonal skills, small-eared people are also responsible for cruelty and some of the greatest evils in world history. The government of the time endorsed the writer's ideas and enacted laws that divided children based on the concept of eardness into separate kindergartens and school. The whole of society was divided into large and small-eared classes with separate education, health, and legal systems, separate housing and recreational spheres for each group. Researchers began to test hypotheses regarding eardness with empirical means. They found that several of the assumptions regarding eardness, although not all, had empirical support. A leading research team then of psychologists provided a large-scale study and a meta-analysis of previous eardness studies. All results showed there's a consistent difference between large-eared and small-eared individuals. Twin studies demonstrated that the trait is highly heritable. Psychologists interpret the results in the following way. We must conclude that the difference is an irrefutable fact. Eardness has a biological correlate that can be measured objectively and reliably. and twin studies show that weirdness is a highly heritable trait. It is reasonable to separate these two groups into different spheres of social life. So we're going to come back to this from time to time. The knowledge transfer that was conveyed to the public, to colleagues, to students, to textbooks, is that science shows that there's a systematic, natural, and psychological difference between large-eared and small-eared humans. It is real and has a biological foundation. The first move then in terms of auto-epistemology is to ask oneself, is this part of my knowledge? Has this become part of my knowledge? And the second move is one of equity, diversity, inclusion. To which degree was equity, diversity, inclusion accounted for in this knowledge? And this can be further divided into traditional EDI and critical EDI. So EDI would ask, is equity, diversity, and inclusion accounted for in knowledge? And the critical EDI would ask, who determines that? Who can ask those questions? Who has the power to ask these questions? And so critical EDI would be connected with a critique of societal power. And I think EDI in its traditional sense, and many of you are probably familiar with this, and by the way, just to mention this, in the context of Florida, of course, asking questions of EDI is not allowed anymore in public universities. So we are at a stage that what we call a liberal project of EDI is actually already forbidden in some states in the United States. And the point will be, but my point is a slightly different one. My point is that EDI focuses on epistemic amelioration. So were small-eared people included in those statistical analysis? That could be epistemic amelioration. Were small-eared people included in giving those results away to the public? Epistemic amelioration. I think the critical EDI, which includes a critique of power, aims at epistemic transformation. So it's not that we want to challenge, we want to have more samples. It is that we want to question the conditions that led to the question of whether there's a difference between small-eared and large-eared people. I think this is what I mean by critical EDI. Interrogation of the conditions that led to the study of that issue. So let me just make this more specific, and I usually divide knowledge making into 4 dimensions: context of discovery, context of justification, context of interpretation, and context of translation. So context of discovery, context of justification, traditional philosophy of science concepts. In context of justification is basically what we would label methodology. The context of discovery itself is always a critical dimension, is usually excluded already in psychology. Why is someone interested in studying weirdness? When, how, where, and why did weirdness become a research problem? And then EDI would ask, were small-eared people included or consulted on research and practices on weirdness? And the critical EDI would ask, what is the politics of science? What is the politics of psychology? In which degree does science and psychology collaborate with political demands, with political realities? In the context of justification, which is what we usually would label, research methods, methodology, what we teach students in statistics and research methods courses, the nature of samples, measure statistical tests, the appropriateness of statistical tests. And then the question for EDI would be, were small people included or consulted on how to do the studies? And critical EDI would ask the politics of method. To which degree is method itself a political choice? So let me give you an example. We can have methods that are status quo supporting, or we can have methods that are status quo transcending. So if I use a t-test and find that there's a difference between small-eared and large-eared people, this is basically a status quo supporting method. It doesn't challenge, so to say, the situation that led to the construction or constitution of small-eared and large-eared people. The context of interpretation. Is this difference natural or social? Does separation or segregation really follow from the results? So you find differences and you interpret it as natural. Well, is this the right interpretation of difference? Is segregation a right interpretation that follows from the results? And were small-eared people included or consulted on interpretations? That's important because usually, marginalized people are not included, consulted on interpretations. And so this is the project of EDI, and the critical aspect would be the politics of interpretation. Which interpretations gain tractions, which interpretations have power, which interpretations are absorbed by the public, which interpretations are liked by the public. And finally, the context of translation. What are the consequences of this knowledge for small-eared people in the public? So how do we give this knowledge away to the public? And then we can ask again, similar, were small-eared people included or consulted on how to give results away to the public? And then you have again the politics power of dissemination. So the fact that, for example, if you publish and give away scientific racist information, I have a hesitation calling it knowledge, but if you give away those interpretations to the public, there is actually a lot of support, political support for doing that, and you gain a lot of attention and traction if you do this. This is what I mean by the context of translation. I tried to show you how we can ask from the perspective of EDI and how we can ask from the perspective of critical EDI. But I want to come now back to the first movement, which is auto-epistemology, by which I mean the imperative to interrogate my own knowledge. Auto-epistemology has been coined by analytic philosophy. It's basically opinions about one's own opinions in this tradition. But when I talk about auto-epistemology, I want a combination of subjectivity with epistemology. And it's based more on critical traditions and closer to feminist auto theory that combines autobiography and theorizing. When I talk about subjectivity, I don't talk, yes, I mean the first person somatopsychological life, but I don't just talk about internal dynamics or what I call intrasubjectivity. So in my understanding of subjectivity, the social, cultural, and historical, as well as the relational and interactive, as well as personal idiosyncrasies and the body are entangled. So I have a theory of subjectivity that has to account for all those dimensions. And so auto-epistemology then means how my knowledge is connected to histories, cultures, and societies, as well as to academic communities I participate in, and my personal cognitive, affective, and motivational preferences and experiences. How my knowledge that I have is connected actually to power. That is what I have to interrogate in auto-epistemology. And I give you some concrete examples what I mean by that. So what constitutes my knowledge? Well, the first realization is, I guess, that what my knowledge is embedded in what is considered true and relevant at a point of time in a given location. So I cannot catapult myself outside of my culture. Yes, I can, of course, learn about other cultures. And some people are bicultural, multicultural, and have different experiences, of course. So it's not just one culture that plays a role there. But that is, so to say, more possible than catapulting ourselves outside of history. Yes, I can go back 1,000 years. I can study historically what people thought 1,000 years ago. It's, of course, more difficult to do that, assuming to know what people think in 500 years in psychology, or about mental life, or about the mind, or about subjectivity. So my knowledge is always embedded in what is considered true and relevant at a point of time in a given location. I can ask myself as a psychologist, do I have a methodological theory of truth? The argument that in psychology, we have implicitly, unconsciously, unaware, subscribe to a methodological theory of truth, which means if I follow the standard best research practices of psychology, then I implicitly have constructed or developed truth. So there's usually no courses anymore on truth in psychology. It's just follow the standard methods, follow all rules and regulations in research, then you implicitly have somehow constructed truth. And so I think my point here would be to ask if this is actually what I endorse as a psychologist. And so, I follow the standard research practices and looking at the difference between large-eared and small-eared people. And I used the t-test, I had good samples, and I found a difference. Well, there's a difference between large-eared and small-eared people. That's the truth. And of course, from my perspective, it's more complicated than that. But then it's a question, so to say, that, what kind of theory of truth do I actually have? Is my knowledge based only what is produced in academic articles? So psychologists tell students that they have to look at research articles that have been published in the last 5 years. And the question is this really, so to say, what constitutes my knowledge? Only what is produced in academic articles? I think a fair answer would be no, of course not. We have also first-person experiences. We have community and cultural experiences. I'm going to come back to that on the next slide. And is it really the case that I can do justice to mental life if I focus on the psychological sciences? Or to which degree do I need the psychological humanities, as we call it? To which degree do I need philosophical thinking, historical thinking, political theory, social theory, economic theory, post-colonial theory, feminist theory, and even the arts when it comes to doing justice to human mental life? And should my knowledge be limited to what is produced in the psychological sciences? And finally, coming back to the question of EDI, how much diversity does my knowledge include? How much is it inclusive, my knowledge? And how much equity is included in my knowledge? And of course, the same applies to the question about critical EDI. How much of my knowledge is subject to an analysis of power, to an analysis of colonialism, to an analysis of dispossession, and so forth? And so to pick up on what I just said in the previous slide, I can ask myself, where is what I know coming from? How much comes from authority? That includes parents, teachers, professors, peers, textbooks, research articles. And how much of this authority is a Western authority or a Northern authority? How many research articles, textbooks, knowledge do I include from the South, for example? Is that part of the authority? I don't mean authority in a negative sense. I mean authority in a descriptive sense. How much of my knowledge comes from experiences and observations? Personal experiences, personal observations, or scientific experiences, scientific observations. So if you read a research article, it's not actually it's not your scientific observation, it's somebody else. And it has, of course, an element of authority to that. And as I said, I don't mean this in a negative sense automatically, but in a descriptive sense. How much of my knowledge comes from thinking, reflecting, theorizing? How much comes from intuition, revelation, speculation? And again, the question, does my knowledge contain EDI? Does it contain critical EDI? So it's a question I can ask myself. And I can also ask myself, what do I ignore? Do I ignore the role of values? Realizing that objectivity itself is a value. Objectivity is not only, my point, objectivity is not only an epistemic category, but also an ethical category. And equally, one can make the argument that EDI is an epistemic category, an epistemic value. And in terms of my own subjectivity, how do my own social characteristics play a role in the representation of psychosocial kinds? My class, my gender, my race, my disability or ability status. And when I teach epistemology in my class, I also ask, how would we do psychology if all psychologists in its history have been women? So a thought experiment, all men die at the age of 18, let's say, so they cannot produce researchers or scientists. And if all psychologists in its history have been women, how would psychology look like? Would we have the same topics, the same methods, the same theories, the same practices? And if your answer is no, well, obviously gender plays a role. And you can ask the same question about, does culture and history or colonialism play a role in psychological research? And so I similarly ask what we do if Nazi Germany had won World War II and inaugurated a new world order. What kind of psychology would we do? And I can imagine what psychology we would do because I'm more familiar with the history of Nazi Germany. But you could ask similarly, what kind of psychology would we do if Imperial Japan had won the Second World War? And this means to ask the question how my knowledge is situated. And where do I have an epistemic advantage and where do I have an epistemic disadvantage? Do I really have an epistemic advantage when I want to do a study of suicide in Indigenous communities in Canada because I'm an expert, let's say, I'm just making this up, on impulsivity, and I have a great impulsivity scale, and I fly in to northern communities and give them a questionnaire about this topic and come back and do an analysis and find something trivial or irrelevant. Do I really have an epistemic advantage or do I have an epistemic disadvantage? So this is the question that I have to ask myself. And just to point out, when I talk about I and me, I don't always literally mean I or me. I mean a more generalizable I or me. And of course, these answers, I think I say this in my conclusion, cannot be solved solipsistically, but has to be done in dialogue and in collectively, basically. So this points to the limits of my knowledge. You know, to which degree are my traditions limiting my knowledge? So if all of us emerge from certain cultural and psychological traditions, to which degree is it that I have a behavioristic tradition or psychoanalytic tradition or phenomenological tradition or neuroscientific tradition produces limits to my knowledge? What is my horizon? I can have a narrow horizon or a broad horizon. And should I aim for a narrow horizon or should I aim for a broad horizon? And my argument would be that a broad horizon sets the conditions for the possibility of more justifiable knowledge. It doesn't guarantee it, but it sets the condition. So I would favor aiming for a broad horizon, which is exactly what I mean, the psychological sciences and the psychological humanities. And of course, we encounter people when we teach students who like to answer everything that's within an evolutionary psychological perspective. And I try to encourage, obviously, to expand that horizon. How is my subjectivity contributing to knowledge? And as I said before, I don't just mean intrasubjectivity, internal dynamics. I mean sociosubjectivity and intersubjectivity. To which degree does my ethnocentrism and time-centrism limit my knowledge? And I don't mean ethnocentrism, again, in a negative sense, in a descriptive sense. So I come from a certain cultural context, and that is the same time produces limitations to my knowledge. And I come from a certain time, and that produces limits to my knowledge. Am I showing epistemic humility or epistemic grandiosity? And I think so I'm not gonna go into detail. I've published about this topic. And finally, what about critical EDI? What do I know about other cultures, about other times? What do I know about colonialism? And so this may set the stage for the limitations of my knowledge. So this is the first movement. And then sort of say, you know, if you like, a self-critique and a self-awareness, a self-enlightenment to a certain degree. And then I make the case for EDI and critical EDI. So in the context of discovery, and I mentioned this before, the question, why is someone interested in studying what they are studying? Why is this question asked and what is not asked? Why are you asking about differences when it comes to Eerdness, but not about the socio-historical constitution of Eerdness? What is the role of money, power, and interests? So to which degree does funding, class interests, if you like, white interests lead to asking that question? The role of history, culture, society, and relationships more broadly, and the politics of science. In the context of justification, why do you study it that way? How do you justify your claims? Are statements verifiable, falsifiable, valid, reliable, objective, generalizable? This is the traditional methods again that I mentioned. And from a more critical perspective, of course, you can ask, do the methods that you choose do justice to the problem? And also more traditionally, the role of instruments, measures, concepts, organizations, etc., have to be interrogated. In the context of interpretation, how do we make sense of what we found? How do we make sense of a difference between large-eared, small-eared people? How do we interpret this data? Can there be violent interpretations? My answer to that is yes. And how is research conveyed, used, applied, implemented? What is given, not given away to the public? Why? So for example, Lisa Cosgrove and her colleagues found that there are systemic, identifiable financial conflicts of interests by authors of the DSM. So she's done this over, a decade, more than a decade now, identified empirically those financial interests, but that is usually not given away to the public. In the book, they don't write or list a financial conflict of interest, so a reader and the public could be made aware that there are financial conflicts of interest. Why is that not given away to the public? And the same questions can now ask from the perspective of autoepistemology. Why am I interested? So, I don't want to go systematically now for all these issues again. Why am I interested in studying what I'm studying? What I'm asking, what I'm not asking? Why do I study the way? You can look at it through the hermeneutics of EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion, and you can look at it from the hermeneutics of power, a critical EDI, where we introduce indeed the question of power in analyzing the scientific process. But that is basically, if you like, my take-home message, that we look at it for the perspective of autoepistemology, we look at it for the perspective of EDI, and we look at it for the perspective of critical EDI. I'll give you a few more examples here. I think we've discussed this already. When it comes to the researcher, when we ask about the context of discovery, does this research have an epistemic advantage or disadvantage? Who was included, excluded as a researcher? What position and situation does the researcher present? So does a person with ability talk about a person with disability? Does a person from the north talk about a person from the south, and so forth? Who has the power to ask the questions? Why is it that we listen more, let's say, to a person from the north than a person from the south? And who has the power to ask these questions? And to which degree have we think about the researcher in terms of class, gender, race, etc., which includes the politics of epistemology. So I covered this a little bit already, so I'm not going to go into more detail that. In the context of justification, I think we have to ask, and this question is not asked enough anymore, which method is doing justice to the problem? We just assume that's what I call methodologism, follow the research methods, and you're going to find truth. But is this method actually doing justice to the problem? And the most classical example, of course, is sampling issues. Knowledge is based on what kind of human, so this is pretty much acknowledged, even traditional psychology, although actually the practices don't really change. So been lots of publications that, psychology is based on undergraduate students from the north on American samples. Psychology has to become less American. Those type of articles are important because they show that it's based on a small sample of humanity. But of course, from a critical perspective, this is insufficient. But it's important to ask who was included, who was excluded. And a more critical question would be what researcher-participant relationship is doing justice to human mental life. It's really a relationship that focuses on me as the subject and you as the object, as the passive means to knowledge, a relationship that does justice to human mental life. You're just numbers, you're just samples, and I, as a researcher, use you as a source of information that I can publish. Is that really a relationship that is just doing justice to human mental life? Maybe that's just human mental life under capitalism. So what is the political role of methods? Would be a question. And so my point is that you can make any kind of group of human beings into problems. And you can do this sociopolitically. Let's say, think about migrants. You can do a sociopolitical problematization by introducing laws, rules, or regulations that make it illegal to do certain things. You can do this sociopolitically. You can do it theoretically by providing theoretical discourses, by providing theoretical analysis, why migrants are a problem. But you can also do that empirically by finding differences in terms of psychological factors, in terms of aesthetic criteria and so forth. You can do an empirical problematization. You find that large-eared and small-eared people are different. Well, right there, the method is not true. You have empirical problematization. And you can do it, of course, visually nowadays. We know that where we have the dominance of visualization, that by showing migrants in a certain way, you can contribute to visual problematization. So method is not just neutral. Method can contribute to the problematization of groups of human beings. And you have a choice of a psychology about to or a psychology for and with people. Or to say it more slightly differently, you can understand X as a problem to understanding the problems that X encounter in a given sociocultural context. So from understanding migrants as a problem to understanding the problems that migrants encounter in a given sociocultural context. That would be, so to say, a different approach. And that requires different types of methods and methodologies, obviously. Context of interpretation. So the problem of underdetermination, and I've published, of course, on this area, the fact that the realm of data is not identical with the realm of the interpretation of data. So I have located epistemological violence in the interpretation in the context of interpretation. Of course, you could locate it also in the context of discovery, in the context of justification. I located it in the context of interpretation because I think you can find a more general agreement also by more traditional psychologists that this is actually indeed a problem. Interpretations impart meaning to data, make results understandable. And then people then talk about facts. It's basically data and interpretation. So we have to keep an eye towards that, to which degree. And my point has been, people don't publish numbers in textbooks. They don't publish numbers in psychology today. They don't publish numbers in social media. What they publish are verbal descriptions, which contain often data and interpretations. And interpretation have a speculative element. And epistemological violence is when academic interpretations of empirical results implicitly or explicitly construct the other as problematic, inferior, deficient, pathological, although alternative interpretations exist. So the small-eared, large-eared people difference, although alternative, and they should be segregated, of obviously alternative interpretations exist to that. And it has to include, obviously, the analysis of power. Who has the power to propose such interpretation? So from a critical EDI perspective, it's not just good enough to add somebody to the interpretations, but to analyze the power that allowed for such interpretations to gain traction. In the context of translation, we have, of course, the call for a diversity of authors, diversity of editors, diversity of reviewers. That is, of course, pretty standard now. A diversity of language is less standard. That becomes more complicated already. That English is still the lingua franca of academia and considered the standard in the form where you have to express yourself. The diversity of outlets is also more problematic. Of course, certain journals with all these numerical assessment factors are considered more important than other outlets. So here you have, of course, a role of supremacy. Diversity of knowledge translators, it's all still sort of say not happening to the degree. And I think you have to analyze translation in terms of supremacy, the implicit idea that there is actually a hierarchy that can be ranked, that makes certain authors, editors, reviewers, languages, outlets, large translators superior to other entities. And this requires, of course, a critique and a transformation of status quo, but it has to go beyond, so to say, diversity of editors. And my point is here, so to say, to keep in mind what I said before, that, you know, we look at it through the perspective of alt epistemology, yes. We look at it through the perspective of EDI, and I don't have a problem with that. I think it's, of course, as critics have pointed out, it's done performatively and not taken seriously. And I think a critical EDI actually wants to interrogate this through the issue of power, privilege, and supremacy. So we have to ask, actually, who has the power to ask for EDI in the context of discovery, justification, interpretation, and translation? So the power is not distributed equally. Who has the financial, institutional, and cultural capital to ask for or refuse EDI? And why did it, how does this come about that we actually don't have equal financial, institutional, and cultural capital to ask for EDI? It's not good enough to focus on good intentions of the powerful. It's an issue of socioeconomic justice, which probably requires struggles, not give-outs, not handouts, and it has to obviously challenge the structural basis of a situation that led to a point where people have to ask for EDI. Power has to be interrogated, privilege has to be interrogated, supremacy has to be interrogated. And it's not only about adding more diversity when doing psychological science. Psychological science itself is problematic, and I think I'm published here on Wide Epistemologies in Psychological Science. And it's not only the politics of science that we have to look at. Yes, we have to look at that, but also the logic of psychological science itself that is, that is covered in neglect, omission, and supremacy. So skip this. Coming to the conclusion, we have not much time left. So in terms of intersubjectivity, yes, I need to broaden my horizon and include temporality and contextuality when it comes to knowledge. I should actually, because of the complexity of knowledge, because of the traditions and the horizons and the cultural limitations of my own knowledge, favor epistemic modesty over epistemic grandiosity. That is very difficult because under neoliberal conditions, which would be a critical assessment, under neoliberal conditions, epistemic modesty is, of course, not reinforced. It's the opposite. You have to be grandiose about your own knowledge contribution. You have to be an entrepreneur. You have to be entrepreneurial about your own knowledge contributions. And so epistemic modesty is naive in that sense because it contradicts the societal historical requirement in academia and beyond within a neoliberal academia to emphasize epistemic grandiosity. I have to ask the way to which human knowledge is embodied. And I think many of us have experienced that leaders in university presidents, deans ask for equity, diversity, inclusion, but at the same time, they have to go to human rights tribunals about how they discriminated against racialized scholars in their own universities, where they do exactly the opposite of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so it becomes really just a performativity that people say equity, diversity, inclusion is important, but it's not really embodied in the subjectivity of those who promote this. I have to include, of course, my location, situation, and subjectivity when it comes to knowledge. And I have to ask myself, do I want to ameliorate the epistemic status quo, make it better by having more samples? I'm not opposed to that. Or do I want to transform the epistemic status quo, which obviously would be the imperative from a critical point of view that the whole epistemic status quo is actually problematic, and you have to move beyond, so to say, the status quo. In terms of intersubjectivity, I can ask, do I want a psychology with people or psychology about people? Are participants a means for me or an end? Are participants means to further my own career and I can publish another study, or are they really an end in my endeavors? And my point here is that we have to do those things together. That's an intersubjective. I cannot just say, oh, I thought about my limitations and I don't have limitations. That's what I figured out. Well, that is obviously not sufficient. It has to be done together, and together means it has to include indeed people with diversity and people from the North-South, but also people that challenge, so to say, the power that I embody. So it has to be done together. The same with incorporating a broader perspective has to be done together. Someone says we have to include post-colonial theory. Well, it has to be done together and not solipsistically. And the same thing about EDI and critical EDI, it has to be done together. And I know I'm running out of time here, so my last slide here. Yes, the temporal contextuality of all knowledge is entangled with history, culture, and society, the need for an analysis of power, and that a decolonization requires decolonization not only of psychology, but also society, and that the same thing with anti-racist stance cannot be confined to psychology, has to be done in society, has to include a systemic structural perspective. Okay, so I think I kept pretty much to the time frame, and I'm happy with any questions that emerge.
Thank you very much, Professor Tia. I enjoyed your talk, and I believe so many people did. I would like to open this time for discussions and questions. If anyone wants to ask anything from Professor Tia, please raise your hand or put your question in the chat box. But maybe while you are doing that, I've got one myself, which connects to something I also discussed in the morning. But it would be good to see what Professor Tia thinks, because he has been around in the discipline for a while, and he has done a lot of work. Now I've got lots of things to learn from him. So I've got one question for you, Professor Tia. The question concerns the politics of power and knowledge dissemination. What would you say about this in relation to the Global South academics in particular, saying that most of their articles and their books are published in the Global North? And when they publish them in the Global North in journals, they have to be given instructions on how the article has to be organized and what kind of knowledge can be accepted in that journal and what kind of things cannot be accepted. So thinking about this, what does this mean to you, especially for in terms of the epistemic advantage, epistemic violence, epistemic disadvantage, and coloniality as well?
Yeah, I think Robert articulated this actually very well. That if that is the outcome, our own horizon, our own traditions will be confined to literature that has emerged, so to say, in the global North. And that allows a critical moment, but it also allows, so to say, an engagement to learn more from those traditions. Let's say if you're an academic from the North, and I'm located in the North, so what does it mean in terms of my own actions? So I think that is one moment to which degree critical psychology itself has this northern, or I call it once an indigenous bias, like German critical psychology is a German indigenous bias, because that's where all the sources come. There comes nothing from the post-colonial or anti-colonial literature, and so you're going to have, so to say, a tradition that is limited to a specific narrow perspective. And my point is indeed, in terms of autoepistemology, to broaden that horizon and that tradition. So that is from that perspective. There's also the perspective, of course, in terms of if you're an editor or reviewer. Yes, it's extremely difficult to do justice to, let's say, somebody wants to publish in a non-English language. So you force people to publish in English language, and then the immediate critique can be, well, it's not very well expressed, or the sentences are not clear enough, and then can be rejected very quickly because it doesn't have, so to say, the same linguistic sophistication as a native speaker. So that's very easily done, and it dismisses ideas. So what is the solution to that? I mean, that's a good point. I don't have an immediate solution, to be honest, but to say that we have to de-hierarchize, so to say, this ranking of journals and consider journals in native languages equally as important. Once we started to look at citation rates and impact factors and all these criteria, once you did that, then you have a seemingly objective, which of course is not objective at all, a criterion of what is considered important, and it reinforces basically Northern supremacy, and that is an act of critique and an act of enlightenment that has to be articulated, I think, more clearly. What does it do for a reviewer? A reviewer should be honest and say, well, actually, I don't know enough about that article, about the sources from the South, and therefore, a standard critique is from a reviewer, oh, he doesn't, or they do not account for the extant literature on this topic, and they should include more of the extant literature on the topic. When they talk about extant literature on the topic, they missed the Northern literature on this topic. And at the same time, the Northern reviewer might not be familiar with foreign-speaking, non-English-speaking literatures from the South. So if somebody has to review a paper from Latin America, they might be completely unfamiliar with Latin American sources, because if they don't speak Spanish, they are not accessible to them. That's from the perspective of the reviewer. What from the perspective of an author? I mean, to which degree do you participate in that academic game? To which degree can you refuse that academic game? That is, of course, a very difficult decision, because institutions then might have exactly the same criteria, that they value English-speaking journals and books and outlets and participations higher than local participation. So some southern countries have sort of the criteria of published in English-speaking journals, participated in international conferences, did not publish in a local journal as a criterion for promotion, tenure and promotion, for example. So the author has to choose, so to say, a strategic move where they can participate, so to say, in some of these academic games, and at the same time refuse these academic games. And that is sometimes easier, so to say, mid-career or late career, where they can refuse these games and not play this game anymore. And they can, of course, try to find collectively and in a community that supports alternative ways of doing these things. And that, of course, has been done in critical psychology to a more or less, successful degree, how this can actually be done. And that is I guess, the difficulty. Can one push against institutions? Yes, I think we can do that by participating in, in exactly those evaluations, by making the case for, well, there's other criteria than the standard criteria in how we should evaluate knowledge contributions. It can't just be that a Western standard of knowledge contribution is counted as the highest standard of knowledge contribution or translation. That I think if we all participate in those institutional and systemic realities, that can be helpful. And of course, finally, some people might choose a political activism where they, where they intend to overcome some of those limitations that, co-construct those, the politics of science and the politics of psychology. And that, of course, is also difficult in a context that is becoming increasingly, deglobalized and reactionary.
Thank you very much, Professor Tia. I would like to ask you one more. I don't think anybody has raised their hand. We have got 5 minutes just to get to this one. Oh, Manuel raised the hand. Sorry, Manuel, I didn't see you. Do you want to unmute your mic and ask, please? Go ahead.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you, Professor Tio, for a brilliant presentation. As always, we learn so much from you. But I just wanted to ask this. I posted it in the chat box a while ago. So I was curious about this idea of critical EDI and how it is either similar or different or in dialogue with others concepts that are classic concepts that focus on power and proposals to look at power. For example, psychopolitical validity, critical interculturality by Walsh, and structural competence. And the same with auto-epistemology. In which ways does it differs from just reflexivity, situated knowledge, and senti pensar by Pals Borda, and so many other traditions, I guess, and concepts that are, classic around the world. So I was just curious about your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have completely no problem if you call it reflexivity. It's epistemology, it's epistemic reflexivity. And there's, of course, many traditions, and I draw on many of these traditions without always pointing out every tradition which I'm drawing on. So I'm coming up with my own system and how to articulate this, and considering, sort of say, as an important domain within epistemology and an important domain within psychology, actually. So people have published about a lot about reflexivity, of course, and have suggested a lot of those issues. Has been a lot of criticism of this issue, and I'm picking up of some of those criticisms by for example, I think Ian Parker, Erika Purman criticized reflexivity if it's just confined to an internal reflexivity where I sit in my armchair and then say, wow, am I too Western, am I too colonial? And then, oh yeah, maybe I am or not. And how bad is this? And how, that type of reflexivity that is just purely internal is obviously rejected. It has to be connected with the idea of doing it in dialogue, doing it together, and including, so to say, a concept of subjectivity that is not based on internal dynamics, but on a concept of subjectivity that includes intersubjectivity and what I call socio-subjectivity. Now you could say socio-subjectivity also has been articulated in literature. I'm not opposed to that idea either, of course, but the entanglement of those elements together, I think, has not been articulated sufficiently. And laying it out as in a theory of principles of subjectivity hasn't been laid out either. So I'm not saying it's, I'm not saying I'm coming up with completely independent, falling from the sky ideas. Of course, what I pointed out, I'm in certain traditions, in certain critical traditions, in certain hermeneutic traditions, and I'm building on those traditions to articulate something that I think articulates something that can be used by psychologists more and by epistemologists more productively, I think, and avoid some of the pitfalls that have been identified in the discussion of reflexivity. But if you want to call it epistemic reflexivity, I have no problem. I call it, sort of, when I write about it, it's a form of epistemic reflexivity, auto-epistemology. That's perfectly fine. And even I say auto-epistemology is not a new term, it's been articulated as well. And the second question, I think, very, very similar, that, when we talk about the analysis of power, yeah, of course, there's ongoing traditions of how we have to articulate power. And again, sort of say, as a person who likes to synthesize or integrate, or likes to draw on a variety of traditions and is aware of some of the contradictions in traditions, I have no problem drawing on a concept of power that goes from, sort of say, Marx to Fanon, to Foucault, to what Isaac Politensky, psychopolitical analysis of power, to what colleagues have articulated in psychology in terms of power. So I think we have to articulate all of those dimensions when it comes to power. And of course, I haven't done it systematically in this presentation, but it has to be done more systematic. What can we learn from Marx? And what can we learn from Foucault? And what can we learn from feminists? And what can we learn from post-colonial theory? And what can we learn from psychologists? And what can we learn from Freire? And what can we learn from if you don't want to have it, author-based, but, what can we learn from different horizons and traditions about power? That is exactly sort of what I want to articulate. And and that is, sort of say, being more, sort of say, a person who likes to integrate things, a project that I'm interested in. So I'm not saying I want to sell something that it doesn't have any tradition. That's not possible. It has traditions, and of course, in written articulations, it has to point out more of those sources.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you so very much, Professor Tio. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but we'd like to thank everyone who spoke today, all our keynotes, and everyone else who spoke, and all the fantastic debates and discussions we had on different rooms. We cannot appreciate you enough, guys. We're so grateful. It's been a great day having you here. And on behalf of Adyan University and the team that is behind this conference, want to say thank you very much.